Right, and we're on. So, hello everyone. We are coming in for our next video. A little later than usual, but we're going to go ahead and get that done today. So, for the next topic video that we've come up in terms of wanting to discuss, now, usually I do discuss president's video every month, and last week I kind of deemed, no, I want to push that back a little bit because our next president is FDR. FDR is going to be taking a little bit because he's a almost four-term president. He's got quite a bit to cover, so I wanted to make sure that we give him ample time and kind of plan that out a little bit. So for this week's video, we're not quite hitting the president yet. We are going to hit another topic going back into English history that had an impact. I'm trying to think here. It had an impact on England up to this day, but also had an impact somewhat on the American Revolution that would come down the road. Not massively, but does have somewhat of a lasting impact there. But it's a drastic change from how England used to be ruled. And what we are going to discuss in particular is what is commonly known as Glorious Revolution of 1688. Now, the Glorious Revolution, as it is so called, was a largely, I should say, bloodless revolution, but it's nowhere near as violent as most revolutions as you would think would get. What ends up happening by the end of this revolution is England gets rid of its previous monarch, adopts Protestant monarch in its place because the previous one had been Catholic by faith, and instills a bunch of parliament that now has some authority over the crown, where beforehand monarchs of England had typically tried to rule by divine stature, by simply ignoring parliament whenever they chose, thinking that the only person they had to answer to was God Almighty. And that is something that sort of changes after this revolution breaks out. And it really implements the modern day, I mean, not completely modern day, but the beginnings of what will become the modern day English monarchy in Great Britain and or England, whichever one you want to say, because it starts putting constitutional limits on the powers of the monarch in Britain. So to go ahead and start here, we got to go back to the 1600s. So, and even a little bit before. So, ever since the 16th century, Protestants and Catholics had constantly been in conflict with each other in England and in the British Isles as a whole. That goes back to the Reformation, which we've covered before on this channel. And in case anyone needs a reminder of what that was the start of a lot of the major Protestant branches starting to break away and separating from the Catholic Church over disagreements that they had over Catholic practices at the time. And this is not just a movement in England. This is a movement that envelopes entire field of Christianity across Europe during that century, during the 1500s, and England is no different. Now, England comes about it in a little bit of a different way, simply because King Henry VIII of England had a problem with wives, and the church wasn't going to allow him to really divorce his first wife that he wanted to get divorced from because she was Catholic and the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain, two of the Pope's largest supporters. But Henry concludes, okay, you're not going to let me divorce the woman. I'll create my own church. I'll break away from you and I will divorce myself because I'll be the head of the church. So that is what ends up happening there. King Henry VIII in the 1500s takes England away from the Catholic Church and establishes the Anglican Church with the monarch at the head of the church, which is still a major church in England to this day. And that Protestant Reformation in England would begin under Henry's rule. It would continue under his son, Edward VI, who would rule for a brief time until he died at the age of 15 in 1553. And then England would take a slight backtrack because King Henry's eldest child, who was his daughter Mary, or Bloody Mary, as we often know her as, Bloody Mary was Catholic by faith, like that of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, who was the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. And Mary ends up coming to the throne upon the death of her younger half brother, and she ends up trying to reconvert England back to Catholicism. She's even married to the King of Spain at the time, making him partly a co-ruler of England at the point. Now, Mary's reign ends up lasting only 5 years. She dies in 1558 without a child, and this leads to her younger half sister Elizabeth taking the throne. Elizabeth is Protestant like her father. She reestablishes the supremacy of the Anglican Church. She ends up reinstating a bunch of the laws that her father had put in place, discriminating against Catholics and trying to make sure that England was a safe haven for Protestant religion. And Protestants in England for the following century would constantly come about with the fears of what they called popery. And popery in England was this idea and belief among the many Protestants there. Catholics were actively plotting to overthrow the church and the state in England. This was not just something that was every once in a while, this was almost constant. Protestants had this fear that the Catholic Church with the Pope was trying to work with Catholics in England to oversee the overthrow of a Protestant regime. And they kinda also believed that it was the wide desire of many English Catholics, whether or not they have any evidence of this or not, that they kinda held the belief that it was the most earnest desire of most English Catholics to have the Pope in charge of the country instead of the king or the queen. Now, England in the following century, in the 17th century, the 1600s, would also become plagued by problems of another sort. Problems between quarrels between of power between Parliament, which is elected body, and the monarchy, which is seen as the divine rulers, but was given by the Almighty God. And this would first come about because of two monarchs in the first half of the 17th century. Most notably, we have King James I. Now, King James came to the throne in 1603 upon the death of Elizabeth. He was her distant cousin. She had died childless as well. He had also been King of Scotland already as James VI, so kind of united the English and the Scottish crowns. And James comes along, and he is very much an absolutist kind of monarch. He believes that he should have all the power, that he should be able to dictate the whims and desires and laws of the nation without any input or any kind of interference from Parliament. He viewed that he was a ruler appointed by God, and thus the only person that he had to answer to was God himself. He didn't think that I don't have to answer to the people, I don't have to answer to Parliament, I can do what I want. James largely gets his way during his reign. He ends up dying in 1625, and he has turned England into a little bit of a quarrel of the sort where the monarchy is now actively opposing the authority of an elected member body that is elected by the people, that being Parliament. His son, Charles I, is not much different than his father, and that creates a lot of tension because of the factor that Parliament already isn't liking that the monarchy is trying to challenge their authority, and now his son is becoming the very same way. Long story short, the quarrels over power would eventually culminate in the English Civil War in the 1640s that would ultimately see King Charles I captured, tried for treason, convicted of treason, and then in January of 1649 executed and beheaded for treason. And for about a period of roughly 9 or 10 years, England would actually not have a monarch. They reverted to what they called Commonwealth, a sort of republic, but that didn't work out real well. The people in charge of it, like Oliver Cromwell, were not the most able bodied people to actually put that experiment into practice. And within so many years, the whole experiment was on the fail. So by the end of the 1650s, after the death of Oliver Cromwell and the arrogance of his son, many of the people in England are desiring to have the monarchy back, and they go and ask Charles's eldest son, who would have been the heir to the throne, who is also named Charles, to please come back and take the throne and please rule over us on the condition that you don't execute any of us that were involved in the execution of your father. But we will invite you to come back and reign over us again on the throne, which Charles accepts and becomes king in 1660 when he comes back to England and officially takes the regal name of Charles II. And this is where our story for the revolution of 1688 is really going to start to begin. Now, Charles II is Protestant. Most of the kings of England at that point, ever since Mary had been, all the monarchs since Bloody Mary had been Protestant by religion. Now, during Charles II's reign, there are worries of a Catholic conspiracy. Now, mind you, this was not completely unfounded. We had had the Guy Fawkes incident just a couple decades before, where the whole planning to blow up Parliament and everything else. But we have the major problem that Catholicism is somewhat on the rise in continental Europe. Huguenots are expelled from France. Protestants are also being persecuted in areas that they hadn't before, even like in Germany. And there is the widespread fear among Protestants that Catholicism is actually somewhat on a winning streak and it could soon reach England. Now, at the same time, this also meant that the people started to see enemy countries around them that were Catholic by religion to be the most sincere threats, most notably France. France was a Catholic majority country, and it was feared by many English Protestants that King Louis XIV of France could be seen as a possible invader, since he was possibly at that time the most powerful monarch in Europe. The guy literally is known as the Sun King. He's probably one of the most powerful men in history to have ever ruled a country. Now, this fear of what the English called popery would persist into the 1670s due to an impending succession crisis that would soon envelope the crown. And this is where this story is going to come into play. Now, King Charles II was a womanizer. He was a womanizer from a young age. He was constantly getting with women, he constantly was doing things with women and everything else. Problem being, Charles had a lot of affairs. He had a lot of children that he fathered through these affairs and then didn't even bother to marry the women, but still had them as a mistress at his palaces. Problem being, he was such a womanizer and had so many illegitimate offspring, according to the rites of the Anglican Church, that none of these children that Charles had were eligible to inherit the crown from him upon his death. And that created a serious succession problem because Charles doesn't have any legitimate children, and his health is not exactly the greatest at this point in the 1670s. So, who will inherit the crown upon the king's death? Well, the most likely heir at the time was correctly presumed to be Charles's younger brother James, and James was the problem because James, while he was the king's younger brother, had publicly converted to Catholicism back in 1673. So his brother is officially a Catholic. That doesn't sit well with the English Protestant majority. And this would cause an exclusion crisis to occur between the years of 1678 and 1681 during the end of Charles II's reign. There were allegations made of a popish plot to assassinate the king and place his brother on the throne. In response, Whigs in Parliament at the time would promote exclusion bills that would seek to exclude James from any possible way from taking the crown upon his brother's death. Now, some initial supporters would initially support the bill to try to exclude James from inheriting the crown, but would ultimately turn away from it by being deterred by the actions taken by some of the king's opponents to ensure that these exclusion bills were actually passed. And thus, some of the support that they had early on for these bills ended up eroding pretty quickly because they went out in mass demonstrations and petitions kind of blatantly, openly challenging the king's power, and this was something that some people feared because they knew that James was much like his father before him and his grandfather, where he kind of believed that he was appointed by God and didn't really need to listen to Parliament all that much. Now, in response to the growing resistance to exclusion, King Charles was able to dissolve Parliament on March 28th of 1681. He officially threw his back behind his brother and said that upon my death, my brother will inherit the crown from me. That is not up for discussion. That will become law, and that is my command, and that will be how it is until the day I die. So that shuts down a very early attempt to try to deny James the throne of England. It doesn't really work out. Charles would end up dying on February 6th of 1685, and just as many Protestants had feared, James would ascend the throne that year as King James II. He promised, upon his coronation, to defend the existing government, and many at first somewhat felt reassured. They felt maybe we were wrong about James. Maybe he's not going to push this this Catholic conspiracy that we fear, this popery upon us, of where the Pope's going to control every aspect of our lives and try to uproot Protestant faith that has been enrooted in this country for well over a century at this point. They very rapidly would start to take a different view of the king as he came into power. So going into that, this is King James. This is the guy that's going to be the center of this whole revolution that's going to break out. He is the first Catholic monarch of England since Henry VIII. He converted to Catholicism before he had become king. He inherits the throne after his brother dies in 1685, and he is only going to rule for about 3 years because of his Catholic faith. Not because he was under-equipped or anything, not because he couldn't rule or was, insane or anything, but simply because of his faith. James would end up taking the throne in 1685 with a parliament full of Tories who were very loyal to the king and thus probably weren't going to be likely anytime soon to voice any kind of opposition to him. James would even go to secure further public support by crushing a rebellion that was led by Charles II's eldest illegitimate son in June of that year. One of his illegitimate sons from his many mistresses that he had had during his kingship tried to claim ownership of the crown and mounted a rebellion of which James correctly and after successfully addressed in the summer of 1685, which gained him even broader public support. However, James began to lose his initial support that he had gained very shortly after putting down that rebellion because he expressed a wish to secure freedom of worship for Catholics within England, which did not sit well with the Protestant ruling class, who were afraid that Catholics would somehow get back into positions of power. Catholics at this time were heavily discriminated against. They couldn't even hold government positions, public offices. They couldn't even hold certain jobs simply because of their faith. And this was something that James wanted to reverse, but that did not sit well with the established Protestant elite. He also voiced a desire to remove the Test Incorporation Acts that Parliament had passed decades ago that had barred Catholics from holding public office. He was Catholic by faith, he wanted Catholic advisors. And in order to do that, he needed to get rid of the one law that was actually preventing him from appointing them. Now, when Parliament would voice unease at James appointing Catholic officers to the army, James would postpone Parliament in November of 1685 as a response. He basically started to exercise what he thought was his authority to postpone Parliament whenever it disagreed with him. James would also attempt to secure his religious objectives through his prerogative powers that he believed that he had. In 1686, a court case would establish James's right to suspend provisions of the Test Acts that would allow Catholics to return into hold public office, and also allowed him to appoint Catholic peers to his privy council, to basically hit the king's version of a presidential cabinet. The cabinet members that we have here in the United States that serve as the president's advisors, same kind of thing with the Privy Council for the king. It's a group of advisors, and now James can legally appoint Catholic peers into his advisory circle. James would issue a declaration of indulgence in April of 1687. This declaration would suspend penal laws against Catholics that tried to penalize them and keep them out of certain jobs and other things, and from owning land. It would also grant toleration to some Protestant dissenters, some people that were not Protestant but not Catholic necessarily either, who were living in England, had also been discriminated against, and now James is saying, "Yeah, we're not doing that anymore. We're gonna actually let you have somewhat of a normal life." And that, again, does not sit well with the Protestant majority. Now, that summer of 1687, James would begin pressuring officials to support repealing the Test Acts after he had dissolved Parliament. Corporations ended up getting purged, and he tried to purge all the major areas of England that could voice any kind of opposition to his plan to repeal these acts. And a pliable parliament was what James hoped to create as a result of these purges of these governmental and educational institutions. He hoped to create a pliable parliament that would be willing to work with him instead of against him. And instead, all it managed to accomplish was increasing opposition from the Anglican Tory establishment that was absolutely rooted in Protestantism and absolutely also rooted in the factor that they thought the king was overexerting his authority. In July of 1687, James tried to appoint Bishop Samuel Parker, who supported repealing the Test Acts, as president of Magdalen College. In response, the members of the college refused to appoint him upon the king's recommendation that he be appointed as president of the college. The faculty at the college said, "Nope, we're not appointing him." So, in response, James has the members of the college stripped of their fellowships when they refused his order. 7 bishops, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, would refuse to allow James's second indulgence order in May of 1688. They refused to follow it. They refused to give any sense to the factor that he was trying to lift these restrictions on Catholics. And these 7 bishops would absolutely resist any attempt by James to lift that. They ended up getting arrested and placed in the Tower of London, and later on were actually acquitted at a trial that was done. They actually did have a trial. They did not just get hanged just because the king thought so. They did have a legal trial. They were acquitted in the trial and released and met with a rejoicing public who supported them over the king. So that brings us the situation in England by 1689, well, by 1688 is worsening. The king is starting to really try to forcibly assert his own authority, while at the same time clashing with the Protestant elite of the country, who are absolutely opposed to the reforms that James is trying to make in favor of his own religion, which they see as a threat to their power. This would lead to a very unlikely alliance between these English leaders who were opposed to the king's policies and King William of Orange, or Prince William of Orange, the one of the kings of the Netherlands. Now, a number of English leaders decided they wanted to resist King James even further, and they ended up making contact with William of Orange of the Netherlands. Now, William was actually James's nephew. His mother Mary was actually James II's younger sister, and she had married into the Dutch royal families, and thus had William. And William, this was actually technically his uncle. And what ends up happening is the English leaders that end up contacting William seek his help by pledging to support him if he invaded England in order to overthrow James from the throne. William's help was sought due to several reasons. Number one, William sought English help in tensions with France, and since he was James's nephew, that would also strengthen his ties to the throne. At the same time, he was married to James's eldest daughter, Mary. James's second wife, King James II, also had his second wife ended up having a boy, his first child, on June 10th of 1688, which now threatened to ensure that James would have a actual heir and would possibly establish a Catholic dynasty in England. And this became a major problem because beforehand, many of the English leaders assumed that since James had not had a male heir, Mary, his eldest daughter, would be the one to inherit the crown. And Mary was Protestant. She was not Catholic like her father. And there's like, we might hate this guy, but we can at least deal with him for a little bit more because eventually she will take the throne. His son was likely going to be raised in the Catholic faith, as both his mother and father were Catholic. And they started to realize Mary's no longer going to be in the line of succession because there's now a male possible heir. And at the same time, we could be looking at a Catholic dynasty being established. It was also believed that James was planning on trying to summon Parliament before too long in order to try to repeal the Test Acts, and this combination of events would lead the English lords toward requesting William's aid in invading England to overthrow James. Now, William had actually, prior to being contacted by these English leaders, he had already been making preparations to actually invade England. He was busy in conflict with neighboring France, and he wanted England's support. So far, that had not been really given to him, and thus William was kind of encouraged to take the English lords up on their offer by saying, if I come in and overthrow James, then that would secure some sort of an alliance or even rule over England, which would allow me to confront France more directly. So pledge would allow him to present his invasion of England that he had been planning originally, that would have been seen as an act of hostility, as simply a mercy mission on behalf of the English people who had requested it. He would assemble a flotilla of 43 man-o'-wars, 4 frigates, and 10 fireships that would also be accompanied by 21,000 troops who would land on the shores of England and accompany the flotilla there across the channel. In case we need to see a picture here, here is well, this is William of Orange, who was King James II's nephew and soon to be King William III of England. So James would learn of William's flotilla, and he ended up sending a fleet to try to intercept it as it tried to attempt to cross the English Channel. Strong winds would prevent the English fleet from ever actually coming in contact with the Dutch flotilla. William's flotilla would end up landing in England at Torbay in Devon on November 5th of 1688. James ended up assembling an army of 25,000 at nearby Hounslow Heath in order to oppose this landing by William and attempt to actually defend his kingdom. Anti-Catholic riots across the country that would ensue after hearing of William's landing at Torbay would then cause James to have to send some of the troops that he'd gathered away to deal with the rioting in major cities like London and York and Canterbury. And this would cause a lot of problems for James because he realized very early on the people are not with me. The people are with my opponent. They are with my nephew who has come across to steal my crown. James and his army would end up reaching Salisbury on November 19th and prepared to fight. Large numbers of his men and close advisors, however, began to desert him shortly after landing at Salisbury, which would cause James to retreat back on to London on November 23rd without even having engaged William's army. On November 26th, James would learn upon returning to London that his other daughter, Princess Anne, had also joined the Oranges and was going in with William and her sister Mary. This was almost the final blow to James to realize that both of his two daughters were now siding with his nephew. James would announce that he was now willing to agree to William's demand for a free parliament, but he was not willing to relinquish his crown. Instead, William kind of pressed the idea and said, "Nope, I've been asked to come over here and overthrow you. I demand that you relinquish the crown before I will bring a halt to this invasion." Instead, with that response, James got the inclination that his life was in danger, that I need to get out of the country because my nephew apparently means war. He will not settle for just a free parliament. He wants my crown, which will possibly mean he needs my head in order to gain it. So James will end up feeling that his life is in danger and starts to try to plot and escape from England in the meantime. William would advance on London on December 7th of 1688, and James would end up being captured in an attempt to flee the country by fishermen near Sheerness on December 11th. So at the end of this, William was now seen, with James now in custody and captured, and his army largely dispersed with minimum engagement. There had been a few skirmishes between James's forces in England and William's army that he brought across the English Channel. But largely in England itself, there had not been a major battle in any way that turned out like bloody in the thousands. Now, not to say that uprisings weren't going to occur elsewhere in the British Isles, there were also uprisings that have ended up occurring in Scotland and Ireland both, but that's all for another story. Now, William was now seen at the end by mid-December of 1688 with James now in his army's custody. He is now seen as the only one to be capable of restoring order to the country. Right now, England has no king. The country is on the brink of another widespread civil war if it's not already there. And William is kind of seen, you're the strongest, you are holding most of the cards in this game. You have the strongest position to do what you want to do and make England whatever you want. William, not desiring to kill his uncle, would end up letting James leave England and go into exile in France on December 23rd of 1688, which would lead to hopefully a far better outcome at home. On January 22nd of 1689, a convention parliament ended up being convened in England with members from the last parliament of King Charles II in order to discuss what their next steps would be in order to who's going to take James's place. Do we appoint Mary as sole ruler? Do we appoint William? Do we appoint both of them? Do we find somebody else entirely? Now, their original plan was to name Mary sole ruler of England. She was the daughter of James. She had the most legitimate claim to the crown, and thus she should be sole ruler, and William could keep his possessions in the Netherlands and be her co-regent on the throne. He could act as a regent to her since they were married, but he would not be monarch. This didn't sit well with William, who had come across the channel at the English leader's invitation in order to overthrow James, and he made the argument known before them, stating of the factor that no, if I came over here and did exactly what you wanted me to do, you are going to name me co-monarch, joint monarch with my wife over England. We will both be equal in status. And this was something that didn't sit very well with this convention parliament at first. They weren't entirely open to the idea of allowing William, one of the kings and the king of the Netherlands, to come over here, or the House of Orange, and merge his kingdom with that of England. But they eventually kind of came around and said, well, we did kind of ask him to come here. He is in the right to ask such a thing, but is that really what we want to do? Probably not. They kind of argued that we don't want to risk conflict with William. That's not something that we want to do right now. We don't want to risk going to war with him at all. So he come and helped us. It's only fair that we grant him something in return. So, facing that pressure from William and somewhat from his wife Mary, William and Mary would end up being appointed as co-monarchs when they were offered the throne on February 13th of 1689. They would be crowned as co-monarchs, and their reign would be known as that of William and Mary. And that would continue until 1694. Mary would end up dying that year, so until 1694, it was a joint rule. After that, until William's death in like 1702, I believe it would be simply William ruling England. Now, however, the big change that is going to come, they're not just going to give William and Mary the crown and say, "Okay, you got rid of James, good. Now you can be king and queen." No, they want to put limits. They want to ensure that Parliament cannot be challenged the way that it has in the past. And what ends up happening is they end up appointing William and Mary as the king and queen of England, but under conditions. They offer the crown to them, but also present them with a Declaration of Rights, which will become known as the English Bill of Rights, which would also be referred to by several of the founding fathers when the War for Independence would begin in the 1770s, roughly almost a century later. Many of them would cite that the rights that they saw as British subjects were rights that were guaranteed to them in the English Bill of Rights, in the Declaration of Rights from the Glorious Revolution. They believed our founding fathers had believed at the time they weren't aiming for independence. They were simply aiming to be, greater representation in parliament, to actually be heard, to actually have more power. And they argued these rights were guaranteed to them by the English Constitution, by the English Bill of Rights. And this is a little bit where that came from. So William and Mary are presented this document, and in it, it affirms several principles. Number one, regular parliaments will be held that they won't just be every so often. They will be held on a regular, on a scheduled basis. That's not going to be interfered with. It also stated that it was illegal to have a prerogative of suspending and dispensing powers, that the king could not just suspend parliament at any time that he pleased simply because he disagreed with them. It also put that there would be a prohibition of taxation without parliamentary consent. The king or the queen could no longer simply just put raised or lower taxes on their own whims. They would have to get parliament to actually agree to any changes in taxation. In 1694, further restrictions were placed in the Triennial Act, which would seek to further restrict the power of the monarch and invest more power in the parliament, which was an elected legislature to some degree in England, thus establishing what is becoming the constitutional monarchy of England that it has had to this present day. That has only gotten a little bit more and more toward parliament over time. Now, William would also oversee the passage of the Toleration Act in May of 1689, shortly after him and Mary ended up taking the throne, which would grant freedom of worship on some scale, but the scale that it granted it on would be far more limited than what had been envisioned by James for Catholics. And, kind of as a note to that, it excluded Catholics in this toleration bill. Catholics were still excluded in this and not fully granted all the rights and privileges that they should have been guaranteed. So the aftermath of what ends up happening with the 1688 Glorious Revolution is basically just a few things. Number one, it is established, and most importantly, what is coming out of this is the foundation of England that is no longer ruled by an absolutist monarch. The monarch is recognized in some way that they are somewhat subservient to Parliament, that Parliament does have some authority over the crown. It is not completely the other way around. The monarch does not hold all the power as in some nations today, like Saudi Arabia, where the monarch holds virtually all the power. England at this point is ceasing to become an absolute monarchy and starting to transition to that more of a constitutional one, where the monarch is somewhat limited in their powers that they can do and shares it with an elected body. It would also lead to further conflicts, though, that would plague England for a couple more decades to come. Most notably, one of the big things that would end up coming out of that in about 20 years after this was the Jacobite uprisings. And what ended up happening was when Mary died in 1694. Her husband would rule, William would rule until his own death after a horseback accident in 1702. This would leave Mary's younger sister, Anne, to finally become queen in 1702, and then she would die in 1714, also childless, which meant that the Stuart line that had ruled England since James I was no longer, they had no valid heir. Her closest relative that could take the throne was George of Hanover, and he was somewhat German. He was actually German speaking. He ends up getting placed on the throne, which then causes an uprising throughout Ireland and Scotland over opposition to the Stuart monarch, who had originally been from Scotland, who they saw as the, since there was, you know, King James II still had a child alive in 1714, that heir that would have been the heir had he not been overthrown. They argued that he was the proper heir to the throne, not this German prince, and that would cause a whole mess through the following half century as these Jacobites, as they called, sought to restore the supremacy of the Stuart line to the English throne over these Hanoverian Germans who had been invited to take it upon the death of Anne. And that would be a whole nother mess that would go out. I mean, I hope to hopefully make a video about that at some point because that's actually rather interesting when you really look at all the debates and just how that evolves and affects England and Scotland in particular. But it's something that I think we will look at in a separate video, but for the sake of this one, it's kind of an after effect that comes about later, not immediately, but later. It leads on to that. So that concludes, I think, except for this, for the last two images that we have here. So here is a portrait of Queen Mary, who will become Queen Mary II. During their joint rule, they were known officially as William III and Mary II. The College of William and Mary in Virginia, I believe, was actually founded during their reign and thus named for the monarchs. And then here we have a painting of William's flotilla arriving at Corbeil in England when he crosses over the English Channel in order to invade England, which would also mark in 1688, it was the last time that England was actually successfully invaded by a foreign power. Any subsequent attempts to invade England since 1688 have been failures, including that of the Germans, including that of Napoleon. They were all failures. The Dutch were actually, ironically, the last ones to successfully do it. So that concludes for this week's video. So if anyone has any questions, any added information, or anything of that matter, any topic suggestions or anything like that, feel free to put them in the comments section. I will go through them when I get the chance. And for next week, we're going to plan on trying to cover FDR, which is probably going to be a little bit of a longer presidential video than we're used to, but just because he serves the longest out of any president in American history. So we're going to try to cover him next week, given that next week is the anniversary of his death on April 12th, which will be next Saturday, I believe. So we'll try to cover him next week and get through that, and then we'll go from there. So hopefully everyone stays good and well for the remainder of their week, and and going into the new one, and we'll see you all back here then for the new video when it comes out. So until then, hopefully everyone stays well, and we'll see you all back.